The watch appeared on a Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday, because Tuesdays were my mornings. 4 hours of uninterrupted access to the 41st floor staging area before Nikolai's schedule brought him back from the loop. 8 months of Tuesdays I had worked like that. Alone with my fabric samples and floor plans, the Chicago skyline spread out behind the floor-to-ceiling glass like something I hadn't earned yet, but kept showing up to see. I found it tucked inside my portfolio case, a men's watch, platinum, the kind with a face so clean and expensive it didn't need to announce anything. No initials, no card, just the weight of it against my hand when I reached for my pencils, and the immediate certainty that it had not been there yesterday. I set it on the table and stared at it for a long moment. Then I went back to work, because the Vane penthouse renovation wasn't going to design itself, and I had learned, slowly through a series of careful adjustments over 8 months, that the best thing I could do in Nikolai Vane's orbit was appear completely unflappable. He arrived at 12:07, which was late for him. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, unhurried, measured, the kind of stride that didn't alter based on who was watching. His head of security, Sasha, came in first as always, did a half-second visual sweep of the room, then stepped aside. Nikolai's gaze went to my table before it went to me. That was something I'd noticed early on. He assessed spaces before people, as if rooms told him more than faces did. It was probably true, in his world. His eyes landed on the watch. Nothing in his expression moved. That was the first sign something was wrong. Where did that come from? His voice was exactly as neutral as his face. I turned from the window. I was hoping you could tell me. I found it in my case this morning. The silence that followed had a texture to it, not empty but loaded, the way a room feels before a storm front moves in. It wasn't there yesterday. No. He crossed to the table slowly, and I watched him look at the watch, the way I'd seen him look at contracts that concealed problems in their language, with an attention so specific it was almost surgical. He didn't touch it. "Leave it where it is," he said, "Sasha." One word and his security lead was already on the phone. I should have been alarmed. What I was, if I'm being honest, was curious. After 8 months of watching Nikolai Vane control every room he entered, I was more interested in whatever had made his jaw go tight than I was afraid of the watch itself. That probably said something unflattering about my instincts. What I didn't know yet was that someone had placed it there deliberately. What I didn't know yet was why. I had been hired the previous spring to redesign the interiors of 3 Vane development properties. A commission worth $85,000, which was the largest single contract I'd negotiated in 6 years of running my own firm. My contact was supposed to be a project manager named Birch. Then Birch showed up for our first meeting with Nikolai Vane himself, and I understood that some projects required a more direct arrangement. He was the kind of man people described before they described his business. Tall, dark-haired, with the kind of stillness that read as either exceptional self-discipline or something colder. He spoke precisely and expected precision back. The first time I challenged one of his design preferences. A brushed concrete wall treatment he wanted in the primary suite that would have killed the acoustics and made the room feel like a parking structure. I'd done it calmly, with 2 material samples and a 3-sentence explanation, and waited to see what happened. He'd looked at me for a moment that stretched a half-second longer than comfortable. Then he said, "Show me the alternative." That was the beginning of something neither of us named. By November, I had a dedicated workspace on 41. By December, he was calling me directly instead of through Birch. By January, when I arrived at the building each morning, the security desk already had my badge ready. I told myself it was efficiency. I was good at telling myself things. Tori, who handled procurement for the architecture firm 2 floors below the staging area, was less diplomatic about it. "He had Sasha run a background check on your last boyfriend," she told me over lunch at a deli on Michigan Avenue. "Did you know that?" I set down my sandwich. "That's not possible. Kate and I broke up before I started this project." Apparently the timeline didn't satisfy anyone. She raised her eyebrows. "My point is, Delilah, that's not normal client behavior. Mr. Vane has unconventional protocols." "Mr. Vane," she repeated it like evidence. You've been working in his building for 8 months and you still call him that. He's my client. He also called your building's front desk after that power outage in October to confirm the elevators were functioning. Not the power, specifically the elevators. Because you live on the 12th floor. I didn't have a clean answer for that, so I finished my sandwich and changed the subject, and I filed the information away, in the same place I filed everything else about Nikolai Vane that didn't fit neatly into a professional context, a place I'd learned to keep very orderly and very sealed. The watch dismantled that arrangement. 2 hours after Sasha photographed it and logged it into whatever internal system I wasn't privy to, Nikolai appeared in the staging area doorway again, without the security contingent this time. Do you know a man named Raymond Fitch? I looked up from the blueprint I'd been pretending to study. No, should I? Something crossed his face, relief maybe, or a close neighbor of it. He came into the room and closed the door behind him. He's a former business partner. We ended our arrangement 3 years ago, badly. He stopped across the work table from me, hands in his pockets. In 8 months, I had never seen Nikolai Vane look anything other than precisely calibrated. Right now there was something underneath that calibration, visible the way a fault line is visible, not threatening, just present. He's been watching you for approximately 5 months. The room went quiet except for the wind pressing against the glass 41 floors up. Watching me, I repeated. Coffee shop on Wabash every Thursday morning. Yoga studio in Lincoln Park on Wednesday evenings. The farmer's market in the West Loop on alternating Saturdays. His voice didn't waver. He knows your schedule better than most people in your life do. How do you know all this? Because I've been watching him watch you. He said it the way he said everything, without apology or decoration. Since September, when he turned up at a design showcase you attended and spent 40 minutes in your general vicinity without ever introducing himself, he asked the event coordinator for your contact information afterward. I gripped the edge of the work table. You've had someone following me for 5 months, and you didn't think to mention it? I was handling it. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. For just a moment, something behind his eyes cracked open. Not weakness exactly, but the closest thing to it I'd seen from him. I thought I could neutralize the threat before it reached you. The watch tells me I miscalculated. I wanted to be angry. I was angry. But underneath the anger was something I didn't examine too carefully. The knowledge that for 5 months, without my awareness, he had been standing between me and something I hadn't known to fear. What does he want? I asked. Nikolai was quiet for a moment. Information. My development projects contain certain structural specifications that aren't included in the public filings. Raymond believes those specifications, the sub-level frameworks, the access corridors, are worth considerably more than the real estate constructed above them. He was telling me something without telling me everything. I'd spent 8 months learning how he communicated. I understood the shape of what he was leaving out. And he thinks I can get him that information. He thinks you have access, he's right. Nikolai's gaze didn't leave mine, which is why I need you to understand that what I'm about to ask you is not an order. It's a request, and you can say no. He asked me to meet Raymond. Wear a wire, take a public meeting, let Raymond make his offer. Birch's team would be in the room. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division had been building a case against Raymond Fitch for over a year. A recorded solicitation would be the piece they needed. You want me to be bait, I said. I want you to be the person who ends this. There's a difference. The preparation took 4 days. During those 4 days, I learned things about Nikolai Vane that his professional profile didn't include. Things he told me himself, in pieces, during the long evenings we spent in the staging area working through scenarios. His father had built the first Vane development property with capital that came from people who were very serious about being repaid. He died when Nikolai was 19, leaving behind a company that was half legitimate and half something else entirely, and a son who had spent the next 20 years methodically converting one into the other. The structural specifications Raymond wanted were infrastructure from an earlier era. Corridors and access points built into foundations during a period when Nikolai had still needed them, He didn't need them anymore. But they existed, and Raymond knew they existed. And Raymond had calculated that the easiest way to access that knowledge was through the woman redesigning the buildings above them. You could have fired me, I said. One evening, the two of us alone on 41 with the city lights spreading below. When you figured out what Raymond was doing, you could have ended my contract and cut off his access. Nikolai was looking at the floor plan between us on the table. Yes. Why didn't you? He was quiet long enough that I thought he'd let the question pass. Then, you walked into this building 8 months ago, and you argued with me about a wall treatment. Do you remember what you said? That it would make the room feel like a parking structure. You said it would feel like somewhere a person goes, not somewhere a person lives. He looked up. I'd been building spaces for 20 years. No one had ever made that distinction to me. There was nothing professional in the way he said it. I knew that. I'd stopped, pretending I didn't know things about 3 weeks prior, somewhere between the Thursday he personally confirmed. My parking space had adequate lighting, and the Friday he had someone deliver soup when I mentioned in passing that I had a cold. That's not a reason to put me in the middle of this, I said. No, he closed the folder. It's a reason I couldn't put anyone else there instead. Raymond Fitch messaged my phone. A number he'd obtained through means I didn't want to think about. The morning after I agreed to meet him. Casual, pleasant, as if we were acquaintances confirming plans. I responded the way Birch had coached me, curious, mildly flattered, keeping my guard just visible enough to seem realistic. The meeting was at a restaurant in River North. White tablecloths, enough ambient noise to feel private without actually being private. Birch's team was 6 feet away at a corner table. Sasha was outside. Nikolai was somewhere he wouldn't tell me, because when I'd asked, his expression said that some information he was holding for his own mental stability. Raymond Fitch was handsome in the way of men who've spent considerable money on appearing approachable. Easy smile, expensive blazer worn with deliberate casualness, practiced warmth that made you feel noticed until you started tracking where his attention actually went. Delilah, he stood when I arrived. I'm glad you were willing to meet. I know the watch must have seemed unusual. Most people just send a LinkedIn message, I said, sitting. He laughed like someone who had rehearsed laughing. I needed you to understand I was serious. And I needed Mr. Vane to understand I was making contact. He said the name carefully, watching my face. You work closely with him. I assumed he monitors communication channels. I'm a contractor. He monitors the project scope. Of course. His smile remained steady. I'll be direct. I knew Nikolai Vane when he was building his first major property, before it became what it is now. I know what's underneath some of those buildings, and I know that the woman redesigning them has been given access to specifications that don't appear in public records. I wrapped both hands around my water glass. I design interiors. I work with finishes and spatial flow. I don't have access to structural engineering documentation. The CAD files you were given for the Lakeshore property include sub-level schematics. He said it calmly. The way you correct a small misunderstanding. I know because I was involved in building them. I'd like a copy of those files. In exchange, he slid a folded card across the table. I'm prepared to be very generous. I looked at the card without picking it up. The number written on it had 6 figures. That's significant, I said. You've earned it. Nikolai Vane uses people, Delilah. He always has. He gives just enough to keep people useful and calls it loyalty. Raymond's voice took on a note of practiced concern. You've spent 8 months making his properties beautiful. Has he made it worth your while, or has he simply made you feel fortunate to be there? The question landed exactly where he intended it to. I thought of Tori across my kitchen table. He had Sasha run a background check on your ex. I thought of soup on a Friday afternoon. I thought of what Nikolai had said to me 3 nights ago, quietly, without preamble. You became the one thing in this building I was not willing to lose. I kept my expression carefully undecided. I'd need time to think about this, I said. Raymond nodded as if this was exactly right. Take all the time you need. He thought he'd won. I could see it in the way his posture settled. In the car afterward, I sat with my hands flat on my knees and gave myself 90 seconds to shake. Then I called Nikolai. He picked up before the second ring. He made the offer, I said, everything on record. I heard him exhale, slow, controlled, the breath of someone who had been holding it since I walked into that restaurant. Are you all right? I'm fine, he thinks I'm considering it. We have everything we need, a pause. Delilah, you don't have to do anything else. I know, I said, but I have a better idea. The idea took 3 days and every technical skill I'd developed across 6 years of professional design work. Raymond wanted sub-level schematics. I gave him schematics, meticulously drafted, accurate in every dimension except the ones that mattered, with a series of embedded markers that our contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division confirmed would be identifiable as fabricated the moment anyone tried to use them for anything operational. A beautiful, detailed, perfectly useless set of blueprints. The kind of trap that could only be constructed by someone who understood exactly what the real thing was supposed to look like. Birch called it elegant. Nikolai called me at 11:30 at night when he saw the draft files. When did you draw these? Last 2 evenings. At your apartment. I couldn't exactly do it here. Delilah. I heard him set something down hard on a surface. You were alone in your apartment designing a document meant to trap a man who has already demonstrated he can access your belongings inside a secured building. Technically, that reflects more on building security than on my apartment. That is not the point. I know what the point is. I set down my pencil. The point is that you want to be the one handling this, and I handled it myself, and that's uncomfortable for you. The silence stretched. It doesn't make me uncomfortable, he said finally. It terrifies me. There's a difference. I handed Raymond the drive at a coffee shop in Streeterville the following afternoon, a location I chose, a meeting I initiated. Birch's team was already positioned when I arrived. The FBI agents were outside on a warrant that our documented conversations had made straightforward. Raymond accepted the drive with the same easy confidence he brought to everything. He thanked me warmly. He said he looked forward to working together again. He was in handcuffs 9 minutes later, on the sidewalk, still holding his coffee cup. Nikolai was across the street. I saw him when I came out the door. Hands in his coat pockets, jaw set, watching Raymond being walked toward a federal vehicle with an expression I couldn't fully translate. When his eyes moved to me, something in it shifted entirely. I crossed the street. You were supposed to stay at the building, I said. I was supposed to do a number of things. He looked at me for a long moment, the city moving around us. Cabs, foot traffic, a delivery cyclist threading through the intersection, none of it touching where we were standing. You built a trap with your own expertise, and you executed it without waiting for me. Yes. I have a team, protocols, 20 years of experience managing exactly this kind of situation. He paused. You used CAD software and your knowledge of what real blueprints look like, and you ended it. Are you upset about that? No. His voice went rough at the edges. I'm standing here trying to understand how I'm simultaneously the most relieved I've ever been, and more shaken than I've been in years. Those two things are not supposed to coexist. They do, though, I said quietly. Sometimes they do. He looked at me for another moment. Then, come back to the building. There are things I've been saying incorrectly for 8 months, and I'd like to try saying them plainly. In the staging area on 41, with afternoon light going flat across the floor plans, still spread over the work table, he told me. He told me about his father. About the first decade of Vane development, when the decisions he'd made at 25 would take him until his late 30s to move away from. About the structural frameworks in his buildings that he'd been quietly, legally, painstakingly having converted and permitted, contracting engineers to document what had previously been deliberately unrecorded, converting old infrastructure into registered access points. The reason your renovation contract included the sub-level CAD files, he said, is that I was in the process of legitimizing the documentation. Your project provided a plausible reason for an architectural review. A designer requesting updated floor plans for an interior renovation isn't unusual. I sat with that for a moment. You used my project as cover. At first, he held my gaze without flinching. By month 3, I wasn't thinking about cover. What were you thinking about? A woman who told me my primary suite felt like a parking structure. The corner of his mouth moved, and who was right? I had been keeping a very sealed, very orderly place inside myself for 8 months. This was the moment it stopped being either. Nikolai, his name, used plainly, without the professional distance I'd given it for months, landed between us like something set down carefully on a surface. I know, he said quietly. I don't think you do. I took a step toward him. You've been telling yourself that knowing everything was complicated is the same as doing the right thing. It isn't. You watched Raymond watch me for 5 months. You managed every piece of this around me, like I was a liability to be insulated instead of a person who could be trusted. Yes, he didn't move back, didn't deflect. That was wrong. I knew it was wrong by month 4, and I kept doing it because the alternative meant admitting things I didn't have a clean strategy for. Things like what? He was quiet for a moment. Then, you take your coffee with oat milk and 1 sugar. You always have 3 pencils on you, but you only ever use 2. You say, with respect, right before you're about to completely disregard what I've just asked you to do. Something in his expression shifted, went unguarded in a way I hadn't seen from him before. You walked into a hostile situation with a fabricated blueprint and a clearer head than anyone on my team, because you understood exactly what was at stake, and you decided it was worth protecting. Del. The nickname came out quietly, like he'd been keeping it. You were protecting me. And what we've built, I said, both of us together. He crossed to me and kissed me, and it was nothing like what I'd let myself imagine in the sealed place I wasn't supposed to have. It was quieter than that, more decided. The weeks that followed were not uncomplicated. Raymond Fitch's arrest opened a federal review of Vane Development's historical construction records. Something Nikolai had been preparing for, and something that still required months of attorneys and structured cooperation with investigators who were professionally skeptical of everyone. There were conversations I sat in on, because he had kept his word, and conversations I stepped out of, because some things were still his to carry. That line took a few weeks to find. We found it together. Tori met him for the first time at dinner in March, and spent 40 minutes assessing him across my kitchen table, before she said anything direct. You had Sasha vet her ex-boyfriend, she said. Nikolai looked at her evenly. I confirmed he hadn't left anything in her possession that could be used as leverage. Given what we now know about Raymond Fitch's surveillance timeline, that wasn't unreasonable. It was still overreaching. Also true. Tori looked at me. I looked back at her. She picked up her wine glass. Okay, she said. Not approval exactly, but something close enough. The Vane penthouse renovation finished in April. I stood in the primary suite on the day of the final walkthrough and watched Nikolai move through each room, with the attention he brought to everything, seeing the full dimension of a space, not just the surface of it. When he came back to where I was standing by the east window, he stopped and looked at the room for a long moment before he looked at me. You put the rocking chair here, he said. You mentioned your grandmother liked mornings. East light is the best light for that. He looked at the chair. Something in his face went very still, and then very open. In that particular way, that was still new enough to catch me off guard every time I saw it. Del. I know, I said, and went to him. He pulled me in, careful and certain, and we stood in the room I had built for him while Chicago went on below the glass, complicated and ordinary and continuing in all its usual ways, entirely indifferent to the fact that something inside this room had finally been said correctly after 8 months of getting the language slightly wrong. The thing about designing spaces is that you learn, eventually, that a room isn't really about what it contains. It's about the decisions made over time, what goes where and why, and what those choices say about the people who made them. I had spent 6 years building rooms for other people. This one, I had built knowing exactly who would be in it. And when I look back now, that's the thing I'm most certain of. Not the fear that came before it, not the risks that surrounded it, but the absolute clarity of building something, with your whole self pointed in one direction. We figured out the rest from there. Most of it, anyway. The parts that still needed work, we kept working on, That's the part nobody tells you about, that the story doesn't end when the hard part does. It just becomes a different kind of ongoing, one where the stakes are quieter, and the returns are better than anything you managed to plan for.